Welcome to another episode of The Clever Dev. Today we are going to dive into the difference between MUI input labels, like you can see there, form labels, which we've got an example of here, and then the text field label, which, interestingly, is actually just an input label. We'll also add some styling, so this is not the finished product here. We'll add some styling to it, and even hide the text field label, do a couple interesting things there. So stick around. Alright, the first thing that I want to look at is what exactly is the difference between a form label, which we can see right here, an example of, and an input label, which we can see an example of down here. So to answer that question, we have to look at the DOM. So here we are on an input label. We can see that the element is a label element, and that was the same as the form label. But what's different is the classes. So here's the interesting thing. The input label has this class MUI input label -root, but it also has MUI form label -root. Let's take a look at the form label now. It only has this MUI form label -root. So it has some other styling classes, but it does not have the input root class there. What that tells me is that the input label is really a subset of the form label. So now that we've got that established, that gives us a little bit of knowledge. And what the difference then will be is anything that's got styling that's dependent on that MUI input label class, which we can see right here. A lot of this styling is probably not all of it. Some of it might be in this form label root. However, a lot of it is going to be dependent on having both of those classes on there. And so just for anyone who isn't aware, that's how MUI really works. A component ultimately is just a DOM element with a certain class on it, or a certain group of classes. So we're used to MUI world in our JSX, and we say form group, or let's say input label. How that translates, input label translates, is it renders as a label element with input label -root and form label -root, and the visual effect of that is what we think of as an input label. So an interesting thing is that input labels, when they are inside of form control components, and let's actually flip over to our code and see that. So we've got a form control wrapping some of this, but really what I'm looking at now is our text field. You see this input label below it, and that's not what I'm looking at. I'm looking at this text field. Inside of this text field, there's a number of things going on, and this is how every MUI text field works. So here we are at the root level of the text field. You can see that the root element is this form control root. So that tells me that a text field is actually a compositional component. At its root, its topmost wrapping class is this form control, and then we have an input label root. So this is a label element with input label root. What that tells me is that one of the compositional components of the text field is an input label, and the interesting thing is that it behaves differently because it is in a form control. Now, if you wanted to, you could actually go and create your own text field component by composing an input, a form control, a label, and maybe one or two other things. Next up, I want to work on the styling of my form labels here. So what I've got is some code that's already in place just to save us some time, but let's talk about it real fast to all be on the same page. I have a form, and that's the outermost component, and this is just a React form. There is actually no MUI form component. A lot of subcomponents that are for forms that are MUI specific, even including the text field, but I've got some of them highlighted here. But this form is just a React form, so nothing fancy there. Anyway, so I have a form group here wrapping, let's see, it's wrapping my first form label that we'll look at in style. And then down here I have a text field and an input label, and we'll add a little bit of styling to both of those. And just one of the things we'll do is make our text field disappear. So anyway, to accomplish that styling, I have the SX prop on our form label, and I have an object already in place, but it does not have any values. Same with the text field, same with the input. So you can see that down here, the text field, the input. So anyway, with that said, let's get our styling on. So the first one that we'll start with is our text field. And what we want to do with that is we'll change the label color and do just a couple other things to the label. Maybe move it over to the right, kind of a right align using margin. So some interesting stuff we can do. But the most important thing is that our text field first needs, we're putting this styling at the root level, and let me just make a point of that. We're putting it in the SX prop on the text field, so that's at the root. So that's really going on that form control that we saw in the DOM. So if I want to style the label, then I need to create a selector that grabs that label. So simple as that. I often make selectors that grab child elements that based on a class, but there's only one label in the text field, so I can just grab the element. Anyway, let's change the color, and I will use the built-in default theme value of secondary main. That should be some kind of purplish color if I remember right. So we'll get that in place. Maybe I'll be wrong about that. We'll see. Let's see right now, in fact. There we go. Now what we're going to do next is we will change the label margin, so I'll kind of push it over some. And once again, that's within this label selector here, this nested selector. So let's say margin left. Now I'm going to just use a hard-coded value, and so I'll say 65%. This really depends though, so that kind of looks good. That's about where we want it. I'll actually add an ellipsis to this to make it fit a little bit better. But that 65% really depends on two things. Let's see if I can find my label size here. A little bit hard to find the label. There it is. So my label is about 144 pixels wide. So instead of using margin 65%, maybe you could do some math. Like if you, in a little bit, I will set a fixed width on this, maybe make it 100. And then maybe I could say, okay, 100 is 25% of the width of 400 that I've got on this form control, on our text field. And so maybe 75% is what I want to go with. Or you could use a ref to really always have a reference to the text field and be able to calculate its exact width. And I've got videos where I do that actually with like a popper, a drop-down popper. I want to change its width based on its parent. And so I do use a ref like that, so you can find a video like that. But for now, I'll just leave margin left 65%. All right, now let's say that we want to reset our margin back to margin left of 0 whenever the MUI text field is in focus. What we need to do is something like this, MUI-focused. And I'll take a look in the DOM in just a minute and show you how I know that. But basically, when there's focus, then the label itself actually gets a focus class on it. So you notice there's no space or anything. So let's say margin left of 0. Now let's check it out, make sure that is working properly. So there we go, pretty cool stuff. And so let's take a look at where that label is. You can see it right here, and you can even see in here MUI focused right here. Oh, it went away because I clicked on it, but there it was. So pretty cool that the label itself also gets some focus on it, a focus class that really makes it nice for styling. Now, if I wanted to remove it, then I could do something like display none. Make sure everything's spelled right. So then we'd have to fix that gap, of course, but there's a couple things that you could do, such as removing that. I'll just leave that in the code in case. Oh, actually, let's go ahead and see if we can remove that gap too, because that'd be kind of cool. So let's go ahead and I think that will be and legend, and then I'll leave all of this commented out in the code. It just popped into my head how to do this, so we'll make this happen too. So now we've got that legend, display none on that. So we click on that, and there we go. Now you may be thinking, well, just don't use the outline variant, and yeah, you're right, but anyway, it's kind of cool to be able to make these things happen. So our legend was somewhere inside this field set. Yeah, here it is. So I've got to display none on that whenever the focus is in effect, and there it is. Let's go back to our code, keep fiddling around with some things over here. I'll comment these out for now, but they'll be in the, in fact, there is a link to all this code in the video details, and also there's a link to my brand new MUI course on Udemy, and I'll try to put a coupon in the video details if you're interested, but those coupons do expire, so I may, and I can't always have one going, so at the very least I'll have a link to my course, so just check out the video details if you're interested in that. One last thing that I want to show is we've got a little bit too much text in here for it to fit nicely, especially since we bumped it over, but if we simply add a fixed width to it, then MUI will quite smartly turn it into ellipses since there's not enough room. So with that, let's move on to, actually let's stay here for a moment, we'll move on to styling this form label up here. So let's take a look at that in the code. We've got our styling object here. It's just passed to this SX prop on the form label. And what we'll do is let's set a color value just to show how that's done. I like to use RGBA so that I can change the opacity at the end. But let's say this. Take a look at that, see how that looks. Just a little bit lighter there, so kind of a brownish color. I'll give it a max width just to show how to do it. Something simple like max width 200. And in fact, let's make this one also have some ellipses. So we've got our white space, text overflow of ellipsis. I always have to remember if it's an I or an E. And then overflow hidden. So let's take a look at this. There we go. And the last thing that I'll show is we have our input styling. If we wanted to change around the styling on that or customize the styling on our input label, pretty simple. I'll just change the color to something like red. So simple as that. Suddenly we've got a colorful form because our form label and input label are very colorful, and yeah, just some really cool styling, especially with the label on the text field. So if this was good info, good material, and you want more like it, then I do a ton of MUI videos, so please do consider subscribing.